Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. And I know National Writers Series has already welcomed you, and from Michigan Writers, we welcome you, and I know this entire audience is excited and thrilled about this amazing book. Welcome, and we hope you enjoy this time here.
Well, it's wonderful to be back. This really is, as Mario Batali said, one of the most beautiful places in America.
Thank you. Yes. Before we get into the book, and we're going to talk a lot about that, but I want our audience, not all of them will have read the book, to tell us a little bit more about yourself, your life, your background, and maybe how you came to writing.
How I came to writing, okay. I wanted to be a newspaper reporter from the time I was 8 years old, and I can date it very specifically. My dad worked as a proofreader on a Sydney newspaper, and we went to visit him and see where Dad worked, and it was in the days when it was all still hot type, and the ink truck was in the ground floor pumping ink into gigantic holding tanks underneath the building. And it was right when the afternoon edition of the paper was about to go to press, so he took me down to the press floor. And it was absolutely overwhelming, the mist of ink in the air and the clatter of the enormous machines, and then these huge rolls of newsprint sailing across the space. And the papers started landing on the conveyor belt. And he reached out and grabbed one and handed it to me. And it was warm. It was hot off the presses. And I looked down at those inky black headlines, and my 8-year-old self said, "You're the first person who knows what's going on right now in this city." And I really wanted to be a part of that. And that was a pretty grandiose ambition for a lower middle class kid, and but I worked towards that. So when it came time to go to college, I thought, what did newspaper reporters write about? And I thought, well, politics, obviously, there's lots of that in the newspaper, but arts. So I'll do a double major in government and fine arts, and I graduated very well informed about classical political theory from Plato to Hobbes and bicameral parliamentary systems and the uses of tempera and Quattrocento Italian wall painting. And the Sydney Morning Herald hired me, and then they sent me to the sports department.
So talk a little bit, if you would, about the influence of your parents on your life and your thinking. It seems to me you are an utterly adventurous person, and that you've traveled extensively, you've gone to some dangerous places, you've had some serious brushes with that danger. And so did their influence on you give you that sense of adventure, or what is their influence on your life?
They were both avid readers, real word people. So it was all about books and stories for us. We didn't have a lot of material stuff. In fact, my childhood was a very small world. I mean, when I look back on it, we went nowhere. We had no car. I lived in a very tiny, circumscribed, lower middle class neighborhood, but it was full of imagination. And both my parents were very good at bringing every possibility into that quite circumscribed space. And I think like a lot of Australians of my generation, we grew up very turned out to the world because our neighborhoods were full of immigrants. It was like the United Nations on our street. We had Serbs next door, Greeks across the road, Turks over the back, Japanese, Chinese, Italians, and they all brought aspects of their culture. So I was fascinated by what was out there. And I think it was an Australian architect who said, Australia was famous for concrete nouns like wool and iron ore. And England and America created art and music. The abstract nouns came from somewhere else, you know.
I think that's worthy claim. That's a worthy claim. Yeah. I'm curious about, you know, this novel, Horse. One could argue the pivotal character is the horse, is Lexington, and
that was the intention.
Yes,
it kind of went off the track, as it were. I just wanted to write a story about a horse because I'd become horse obsessed. That was my midlife crisis. I mean.
And that was to be my question. You have a real connection with horses.
I do now, but I didn't until I was 53. And I don't recommend this. This is not a good way to go about it. If you're going to become horse crazy, do it at 5 or 15 when you still bounce. Do not take up a hobby for your midlife where when you go to learn how to do it, there's a disclaimer on the wall saying that the equine professional is not responsible for injury or death of a participant. And every time you go around the riding ring, that sign is right there. And I'm thinking knitting maybe would have been.
But you have a horse, and you've had several, I think, and you've...
2. The first one, well, so what happened to me was I went to a writer's retreat, and it was in Santa Fe, and it was on a ranch. And there were these beautiful horses there, and I was just admiring them because I love animals. I've always been obsessed with animals, and one of the wranglers noticed me noticing and being there a lot, and he said, "You should come on a ride with us." I said, "I can't ride." He said, "You can." And so I went, and it was like a life-changing experience riding through the arroyos of New Mexico. And I came home, and a few days later, a young friend was over for dinner, and I was waxing about how great this experience was. And she looked out the window and said, "You've got land, you could have a horse. In fact, I could give you my horse." A free horse, what could go wrong?
You didn't see it coming.
This horse was not close by. This horse was in Mexico. But it didn't matter that it was very complicated and expensive to get this free horse because this was a beautiful horse. And I knew that because this horse was in an ad. This horse was in a commercial for a fast-acting cream to treat vaginal yeast infections.
What a horse.
Palomino mare gallops across the Mexican Altiplano voiceover. Some things should be fast.
As one says, yes. So that leads me to this character of Lexington. You know, that seems to be the beginning of the story. Is that where the idea was launched, this whole thing with the horse?
What happened was this horse arrives, and all I want to think about is the horse. I am either, my family can never find me because I'm either in the barn or I'm at a riding lesson or I'm talking to the saddle fitter or the horse masseur or the farrier or the horse psychic. And it's getting expensive, and that doesn't count the orthopedic bills. And I'm not getting any writing done. And that was when fate smiled upon me, and I met this gentleman from the Smithsonian Institution who was regaling a luncheon table with the story of how he just delivered the skeleton of the most famous racehorse of the 19th century that had been forgotten in an attic at the Museum of Natural History and had been rediscovered and was now going to be the centerpiece of an exhibition on why Kentucky is the center of thoroughbred breeding in this country, and it all comes down to that horse. And I'm leaning across the table. And when he got up to what happened to the horse in the Civil War, I was like, I know what my next novel is. And I ran home and wrote the proposal, and luckily my publisher paid me for it, so I could afford the horse habit.
That's beautiful. In Horse, you have those 3 layers of characters. You have the 1850s with the main character of Jarrett, the groom, and Lexington, the horse. And then there's the present time with Jess and Theo, and then there's the interlude with the art dealer Martha Jackson, and it's all braided in a very complicated way. So I think the easiest way to talk about this is to ask first about Jarrett and Lexington. And Jarrett is this incredible character who creates a symbiotic unit with Lexington, this horse. The 2 of them seem integrally tied together. What in your life led you to think about having that kind of intense relationship with an animal?
Because I have intense relationships with animals, and it was always dogs in my family growing up. We always had these beloved dogs, and I think now I know that it's easier to cross the species barrier with another predator species. Dogs and humans look out at the world in the same way. We are looking straight ahead, thinking about our next meal. But when you have a relationship with a prey species, which is what horses are, it's a much bigger divide that you have to cross, because their eyes are sideways. They're looking for what is going to make them the next meal. And once you understand that, you know that it's going to take a lot of calm and patience and sensitivity. And those are all things that are kind of lacking in modern life. But when you forge the connection, when you lean into your horse and she leans back against you, and she does that kind of like expels this breath that tells you she's totally relaxed with you. It's so rewarding. And so everything that Jarrett feels about Lexington is a feeling that I've had about the horses in my life.
So you give that to Jarrett.
Yeah, and it's the love story of the book, really.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, it is, and it's a beautiful story. The hardest parts are when on those occasions when they are separated.
Yes.
Yeah. So just to continue a little bit with the research question, you are writing about horse racing in the antebellum era and how big it was, and especially among affluent landowners, and how.
But everybody loved racing. This was the universal binding material of America in the 19th century. It's hard to imagine now when it's so marginalized, and it's so different now in the way it's the issues of equine welfare are so front of mind. But in the 19th century, it was still an agrarian society. Most people had a horse, or they were only a generation away from having a horse, and they followed these match races between the great thoroughbreds with passionate interest. Everybody went to the track. It was universal.
Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about the culture and about what you learned and how you learned about the enslaved men in that culture?
Yeah, so this was the minute I started researching Lexington's life, I learned that his success was built on the plundered labor and expertise of enslaved black horsemen, as was the entire thoroughbred industry of that day. And formerly enslaved people were critical to the industry in the North. It was big in the North, but not quite as big as in the South. That there it was really huge, and it was a great source of not just wealth, but also prestige to the thoroughbred owners of the time. And that was how you defined yourself as a real gentleman, was being a successful thoroughbred owner. And so, that all of that rested on these unsung, poorly rewarded, enslaved men. They were all men, of course, at that time.
So I'm curious about you took a big risk with this book because you are crossing cultural territory. And in a world where cultural appropriation is often pretty stridently expressed, you're writing in a different cultural experience in a different time period, and you seem to have overcome the stridency of that quite successfully.
No, I was very nervous about it because I'm not stupid. I knew that this was potentially walking into a threshing machine. And I really was seriously looking at, well, you know, when I'm canceled, what can I do for a living? Dog walking looked good to me. Macadamia nut farming in northern New South Wales. and yet, because it wasn't just, because I knew from the beginning that this book would have, I thought 2 strands, it turned out to be 3, but I knew it would have a contemporary thread because I was personally fascinated by the science around the horse's bones at the Smithsonian. So I knew that there'd be a modern story that would frame the historical narrative. And once I understood the role of the black horsemen in the 19th century, and once I understood more about the situation of their precarious lives, I thought, well, I can't leave race and injustice in the 19th century as if it's something over and done with that we don't have to bother our pretty heads about now, because obviously the noise of our reckoning with race was particularly loud. It was a jackhammer during the writing of this book, and I knew that it would have to reflect in the contemporary story as well. And then you're really in dangerous territory because you're writing about contemporary black lives as a white woman. So, yeah.
How did your family either help or hinder? What kind of insights did your family bring to that?
Oh, well, you know, it was, to be honest, it's more, the help came from friends. Martha's Vineyard has had a thriving black community for over 100 years. It was one of the few places where black families could come and have a beach vacation. I think there are only 2 beaches that were open to black families around about the 1900s, and Martha's Vineyard was one. So luckily, living there now these 20 years, I have a, you know, extensive circle of black friends who were incredibly generous with their time and insights and sharing their lived experience. And one thing that you learn living on Martha's Vineyard, like Traverse City, it's a place of you know, privilege, and so, you know, but one thing I've learned from my black friends there is no amount of wealth or education or even celebrity is going to protect you. And every single friend has had an experience, either humiliation or terror. And I think everybody here might remember one, like Henry Louis Gates, Harvard professor, television show host, hauled off his own front porch in handcuffs because a racist saw a black man opening a door of an ice house and called the police. And the cop who came within 5 minutes had him in handcuffs in the back of a squad car. And that's, you know, that's just one example. Another friend who's a very celebrated screenwriter was pulled out of her car and made to sit in the filthy gutter because a racist cop didn't believe a black woman would be driving such a nice car. Yeah.
You were married to the late Tony Horitz, and an award-winning journalist and a specialist in the American Civil War, and I'm so sorry for that loss. Did his interest influence you in both this book and in March?
Oh yeah, he was completely responsible for March because, so we met in journalism school and we pretty quickly became foreign correspondents, and the first, I think, 14 years of our life, married life, we adventured around the world from my home place in Australia to Cairo to London. And then finally he said, I'm homesick. I want to spend some time back in the States. And we moved back to be near his family who are in Washington, but I didn't want to live in Washington because if you're not covering politics, and we were both journalists at the time, it's a bit of a backwater for journalists who aren't. And so we settled in a little rural town in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and then I realized that I had got myself into something because I learned that Tony was completely obsessed with the Civil War. And there's a saying that the Civil War was fought in 10,000 places. And we moved into Waterford, Virginia, and I realized he was going to take me to every single one of them. And, you know, I was pretty churlish about this, and I wouldn't get out of the car at Gettysburg. And not the fourth time, you know. But I did love something that somebody said to him once when he was researching his book. It was a tour that the National Parks Guide was giving, and there was a question from the tour group, why were all those Civil War battles fought in national parks? But I realized I had to find a way to connect with this or I was going to go nuts. And I found it in something that had interested me when I was reporting in the Middle East on all the conflicts that happened there, which is what happens when somebody goes to war inspired by an ideal, a moral cause, but then they are forced to do immoral things in the course of the fighting. And I got really interested in this in the Civil War because the village we lived in had been settled by Quakers, and they were ardent abolitionists. And so when the war came, there was a moral conflict for them between the evil of slavery and the evil of violence, and some young men of the village decided slavery was the greater evil, and so they formed a unit to fight on the Union side. And I wondered about those young men and what had happened in the course of that when they were having such strong views against violence, and they're in this violent situation. And that led me back to this idealist at war in Little Women, the absent father, and so that was the genesis of March.
It's an amazing, again, amazing research, an amazing story, and to choose that minor character in a novel, that Little Women, that almost all of us have read, and to find a whole human being there, I think that was remarkable.
Well, I'm really embarrassed that I didn't know who Bronson Alcott was when I set out on this. But Bronson Alcott, one of the reviewers of March put it beautifully, I thought. He wrote that if Emerson and Thoreau were the shooting stars of American idealism, Bronson Alcott was the dark matter from which they drew their energy. And he really, he fueled the thought of Emerson and Thoreau in so many ways. And he was such a radical. I mean, he would be a radical today. He was an animal rights activist to the extent that he didn't believe you should wear wool because it was the rightful property of the sheep. And he was an ardent abolitionist. They harbored escapees on the Underground Railroad. He put himself in the line of fire to protest the repatriation of an escaped slave. And he ran schools that would be considered progressive even today.
Right. So just to shift back to, I love March, by the way, but to shift back to horse for a minute. In the contemporary strand, you have Jess, a white woman. She's an osteologist, a person who studies bones. And Theo is a PhD candidate as an art historian, and both have unique careers, and you bring them together over the painting and the skeleton of the horse, Lexington, at Smithsonian. Did you see the skeleton?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, the skeleton, I like that. But the skeleton had been moved down to the International Museum of the Horse in Kentucky, so that's where I visited the skeleton. But I visited the osteoprep lab, which is in this chamber of wonders out in Maryland, which is the Smithsonian Museum Support Center. And it is miles of labs and storage pods, and all the art and science in the world is gathered there. So, what you see in the beautiful museums on the mall is 1% of what they have. And everything else is out in Suitland, Maryland. And a funky little corner of this place is the osteo prep lab. And it's funky because if you get an elephant dies at the National Zoo, and the osteo prep lab people are like, oh, how exciting. And then they have this carcass rotting until the bones can be prepared for the scientific study to see what does it do to an elephant to be in captivity for X many years, and the comparative work that they do on DNA and all the fascinating things that bones can tell you about diet and conditions that the animals lived under. And so I go there, and it's a beautiful modern laboratory with all this gleaming stainless steel equipment. And then you find out how the real work gets done, and it is a room full of bugs. And you go into the bug room, and the lab tech puts down a desiccated carcass, and these bugs swarm it. And it reminded me of my son's football team on buffet night.
And you have Jess gets her job at the Smithsonian because someone, the former director, becomes allergic
To bug poo, yes. And this is true. That's how the person who's the head of that lab now got her job. This is the beautiful thing about the weirdest things in this book are the true things.
I think that's true. So I was curious, did you find these particular jobs, the bone specialist, putting it together with a partner with a PhD candidate in art history, particularly interested in equine art eventually, did you find the career first and then hang the character onto it, or was it the other way around?
I knew I love getting up in people's business, especially if it's a weird job like being an osteo prep person. So I knew that was going to be part of this book as soon as somebody said horse skeleton. And there's a defect in the skeleton, and that was a mystery, like what had caused that and what in the horse's life could explain it. And so I knew I was going there. I didn't know the art piece of it until I got to the Smithsonian, and while I was there visiting the osteo prep lab, a curator from the art museum said, we've got an oil painting of this horse. Would you like to see it? It's not on display. We've got it in storage. And so I go to see this painting, and I said, did it come as a gift with the skeleton back in the 19th century? And she said, no, much more recently. And then she said, that's weird. And she said, it came as a bequest from a most unlikely source. This pioneering feminist avant-garde art gallery owner, Martha Jackson, had given all this edgy post-World War II contemporary art that she had championed, people like Pollock and de Kooning and Bridget Riley and all of the art movements of the latter half of the 20th century that reshaped our aesthetics. So she'd given this bequest, and in among all this edgy contemporary art was this one traditional oil painting of the horse Lexington. Why did Martha Jackson have that? And my novelist's imagination went crazy on that. So that's where my art historian comes into it.
And that's actually a beautiful scene where she is contemplating the horse portrait in conjunction with the photographs of her mother riding.
Well, so the interesting thing, again, I don't know why Martha Jackson actually had it. I had to use novelist's imagination to fill in that gap, but I did find out that her mother was a champion jumper, high-level competitor at Madison Square Garden, won everything you could possibly win. Gorgeous pictures of this woman on horseback, flying over these high jumps. And she died in a trivial equestrian accident, slid off a horse, walking. And so I had to use that.
Yeah, that's truth and reality blending with the imagination again.
Well, as Mark Twain says, and I quoted this in the afterword, fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities, truth isn't.
And you have honored that, yes. So Theo's character, he's remarkable, smart, perceptive, a bit naive about American racism.
Yeah, he's Nigerian. His mother's Nigerian, his father is a black American, but he grew up abroad because they're both diplomats. Mm-hmm. So he's come to America only as a college student and now as a graduate student.
And all of your characters, the contemporary characters, have world travel. Did your experience as a world traveler influence that kind of character building?
Well, I gave myself a break with Jess because I had so many characters that are outside of my lived experience. I thought, I just need one that I don't have to research. So Jess is essentially me, who comes to the United States on a graduate scholarship to get a master's degree and gets offered a really fantastic job and ends up staying longer than she intended.
Imagine that. The world travel that you have done, has that influenced, I mean, I'm thinking also of your earlier book, People of the Book, even The Secret Chord, so much world traveler. How has that influenced your writing? How has that brought it alive, or
I
can you
don't
talk
think
about that?
I don't think I would have been able to write any of these novels if I hadn't had all those years as a foreign correspondent. I mean, I'm still feeding off the fat of the experiences that I had. Being the intruder into people's lives at the worst of times. You crash into a country that is in a civil uprising or is at war or is in famine. And you find people and you ask them about the worst times of their life. And you learn so much about human nature, about how people behave in a crisis and how some people are drawn to their best self and some people to their worst self, and how people can be changed by a catastrophe. Particularly, I was very interested in the women of the regions that I wrote about, and some of these women had been raised in such conservative situations that they expected their life to be entirely constrained by domesticity. Like there's a saying in the Gulf, the good woman leaves her home only twice, once to be married and once to be buried. And in Eritrea, I met a woman who had been raised in a village that was still so conservative. They had a menses tent where women had to go when they had their period. And a woman wasn't allowed to address her husband unless he talked to her first. I mean, and yet that woman that was telling me about that upbringing, when I met her, was leading troops in the siege of Asmara. And she had this whole squadron of men that she was the commanding officer of. So if you see people really change that much in real life, it frees you as a novelist to allow your characters to change.
Oh, that's lovely. So may I ask about the Nigerian incident?
Oh, you mean my experience in Nigeria? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So I'm still very much a foreign correspondent and an activist from the Ogoni tribe in the Niger Delta comes to New York to tell the foreign editor of the Wall Street Journal a pretty astonishing and implausible story about how Shell Oil is in cahoots with the military dictatorship of Sani Abacha, and that these desperately impoverished subsistence farmers in the region have, after 35 years of seeing their land and water exploited and polluted and millions of billions of dollars of oil wealth extracted, and they have nothing to show for it, have started a peaceful protest movement, and Shell has called on Abacha to send in the army to massacre them. And I'm like, why would Shell do that? You know, it didn't make sense to me, you know, big companies being so protective of their reputation, and Shell being famously, you know, responsible in its actions in the developed world. But the journal, great paper in those days, and they said, go and check it out. So I did. And I'm down there and I go, and it is worse than he has described. I see all the evidence of these terrible injuries and also the devastation of the landscape in that region was mind-blowing, like oil spills that had been left uncleaned up for 35 years and wells that were contaminated and not one school, not one hospital, not one decent road. So I go and get all that evidence, and then I go to the Nigerian military to get their side of the story, as you do. Bad idea. They just handed me over to the secret police and threw me in the slammer, and so there I stayed wondering about how long they were going to keep me, and I'm mugshot and I'm fingerprinted, and I thought, boy, I'm 39 years old and I forgot to have a baby. And if they keep me any length of time, that ship sailed. Well, lucky for me, they deported me after only 3 days. And I went home and I greeted Tony with great enthusiasm. And our son Nathaniel was born the following year.
Nathaniel was born as a result of being incarcerated in Nigeria.
So I have the Nigerian secret police to thank for Nathaniel, and also for my career as a novelist, because at that point I didn't want to be adventuring around the world to places where you might get thrown in the slammer.
And you have 2 sons.
Yes.
You have Nathaniel and you have Bizu.
Bizu is my adopted kiddo, and he came home to us when he was 5 years old, and he's from Ethiopia.
Did he read Horse?
He read, I don't think he's read the whole book yet. I got him to read the dialogues between the contemporary characters. But the real, I don't know if even Bizu knows this, but Jarrett has a lot of Bizu. Bizu is a kid who thinks a lot more than he says. And in a family of garrulous oversharers like ours, he's kind of unique in that way. But he also has a devastating wit, which he unleashes to great effect. And he's a very deep kid. And so I thought about him a lot as I was thinking about Jarrett.
Well, that leads me to a question about Jarrett and Theo. Back to the book for a minute. The Washington Post Review wrote, his dogged betterment of himself and his tenacious devotion to Lexington serves as a private rebellion against the erasure that is slavery. I thought that was a remarkable line. And I was thinking about how Theo, his contemporary parallel, is attempting a different kind of defiance against those same forces through his work in art history. Was that kind of the plan, or is that?
I don't think I was smart enough to think of that. This often happens.
But it's there.
No, it often happens with reviews. You read them and you go, oh, isn't that clever? I wish I'd thought of that. Now, what I wanted to do with Theo, and again, it goes back to having Skip Gates as a neighbor, and Skip does a class at Harvard every year on the Black experience in America, and he starts every year, the first lecture says there are 20 million ways to be Black in America. And so I wanted to get at some of that complexity.
And I think you did. Jess, on the other hand, the white girlfriend, agonizes about, she's conscious of her own microaggressions.
Yeah, and I hope we all are now. I hope we've all been paying attention.
But they even though they're both prickly about it, they move toward a relationship. And I felt like that was such a gesture of hope. And how does that speak to the sort of larger issue of speaking to each other today?
I think we should speak less and listen more. That's been my experience of these past fraught 5 years, is finally, I felt I didn't have so I had a choice in the point where I realized that this was going to be a potentially controversial thing to be doing as a white writer. And it crossed my mind that there was a way out of this, and I could just center the white characters, the white owners of the thoroughbreds, because they're very interesting characters, and there's a lot to work with there. And then I thought that would be unconscionably cowardly, because it would erase the contribution of the black horsemen again. And I realized I couldn't do that, that if I was going to write the book, I was going to have to do the work. And that involved a lot of listening. And luckily, there's nothing more tedious for black people to explain their own racial failings to white people. But friends did. They were very generous about reading early drafts and putting red lines through things and then making suggestions that would make it more realistic to their own experience.
Yeah. The research in all of the books is astonishing. The People of the Book, Year of Wonders, immense research. I'm so curious about how that comes to be. Are you in a library? Are you on the databases? Are you, what's happening? And at what point do you start writing?
You start writing first.
Oh.
You start writing as soon as you can, because for me it's really important that the story tells you what you need to know. Because I think that there's a real risk, if you front load the research, that you'll find out something really fascinating and you'll cram it in there, but the story didn't need it. And you see it if you're looking for it. My favorite example is, it's a very good book in so many respects, but I could tell that this writer went to a lot of trouble to learn about tuning a piano, because you get to a point in the narrative where there's somebody tuning a piano and the character says, "It must be great to know how to tune a piano. How do you do that?" And then there's 10 pages on how to tune a piano.
Thank you.
So for me, and also I just started to write my first novel. I just started to write Year of Wonders, and I met the wonderful novelist Charles Frazier, and I loved Coal Mountain so much. And great book. And he gave me a great piece of advice, because that book took him, I think it was 14 years, and 11 of them was because he was lost in the library just researching every aspect of the Civil War in his part of, the Carolinas and the Smoky Mountains, and he could not get anywhere because there was so many fascinating avenues of research. Then his wife, who is an accountant, said, "Chuck, this is stopping now. You're going to have to come to me if you want to go to the library, and you have to show me a list of 3 things you need to know. And you may go and find out those things, and then you come home and you write." And that was how he got the book finished.
So one of the unique features of the braided plot is Martha Jackson.
Yeah.
And you've explained where that started, but that interlude is real connective tissue for the 2 parts, for the past and the present. But you might have done without it.
Yeah. Tony wanted me to do without it. He's like, "This is too complicated."
But you didn't, and it's fascinating.
Well, I thought, finally I can use my fine arts degree. No, I just found her story fascinating, because she was so unusual for the day, and she had to, she was a real pioneer, and I love all those artists, and I loved being able to bring them into the story. However, it took me a long time to figure out how these 3 strands were going to connect. And I had to take it on trust that I would write my way into finding it, but it took a long time, and I was very nervous. I had these 3 strands, and they were not braiding. And then suddenly it came to me, and I could figure out what needed to happen to bring them all together.
And the Jackson Pollock piece is also quite wonderful, that she buys the Jackson Pollock.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
That was true.
Yeah.
And it is true that he died in that sports car. So you set out to write a book about a 19th century racehorse, and it leads you straight to Jackson Pollock crashing a sports car.
So both Jess and Theo have troubled relationship or relationships with their moms that is difficult, that influences them. Jess doesn't.
Jess has a great relationship with her mum.
Okay. But Theo
she
is.
does in my mind, anyway.
Yeah. Okay. But Theo is less so.
Theo's mother is incredibly dynamic and forceful. And, and this came from a Nigerian friend who gave me some of Theo's great thoughts, so one thing a Nigerian mother will never say, a B+ is a very good grade.
So what I was thinking about, though, is back to the mothers in this particular horse novel. How did your mother's relationship with you play into any of those relationships?
So I don't know that I say a tremendous amount about Jess's relationship with her mother, but she does it. She admires her mother, who's become an environmental activist in her retirement, and my mother was that. My mother was just the most ardent, the background noise of my childhood was my mother trying to right a wrong. She was on the phone trying to get fair wages for the Greek seamstresses who were being oppressed by, doing piecework for too little money. And she's like, and I'm hearing her on the phone, and she's like, she sounds so like a suburban nice housewife, but the chainsaw is revving under the table. She's going to bring the law down on these guys, and they better shape up. Or she was saving trees, or she was getting a waste dump cleaned up. And so I was thinking of Jess's mother like that.
Okay, that makes sense. You have these six. This is maybe a silly question, but of the 6 primary characters that you sort of work through, which one did you have the most fun creating?
Oh, wow. Lexington.
Lexington.
Yeah.
And which one do you feel is closest to you?
Oh, well,
Is
that's Jess.
That's
Jess,
Jess,
yeah.
yeah. So when Jess finds that painting, that's a moment of connection.
Jess is sort of slightly socially awkward, blundery personality, her intellectual curiosity, her kind of wanting to add her grain to the sandbox of human knowledge, yeah. And I was that kid bringing home stuff from the dump, much to my mother's dismay. I came home with all this awful stuff, and I wanted to look at it under my microscope, and my mother's like, could be anything. And she threw it out, and I said, I'll never get the Nobel Prize for Science if you're going to throw out my specimens. And I was right. I never will get the Nobel Prize for Science.
But the novel. So just a couple of questions about your previous book. Your second book, which happens to be nonfiction, Foreign Correspondence, A Pen Pal's Journey from Down Under to All Over. Can you speak of the importance of letters in the development of your writing and your thinking?
When I was growing up, we didn't have the internet. Oh my God, dinosaurs were walking past the house. But it is incredible what a change that wrought. But in my day, we had to, if we wanted to connect with kids around the world, we did it through pen pals. And it was so exciting. You would write away to these kids your own age all over the globe, and they would write back to you. And my imagination, always on overdrive, imagined what their lives were like, read between the lines. And then When I was going through my father's things around the time he died, I found in his things he'd kept all my pen pals' letters to me. And there they were, all these flimsy aerograms and stamps from Israel and France and the United States. And with that, I could then go and find those people. And we were all 40. And I was able to see what had happened to them and how my fevered imagination of their life squared with the real thing. And so that's what foreign correspondence is about.
But it's also that the power of letter writing and what that does to us.
Yeah, no, and I think that the kids are connecting very differently now. But, it was pretty exciting watching my son was doing one of these massive multiplayer online role-playing games on the computer, and he would come down to dinner and make some comment about the British parliamentary elections. And I'd go, how do you know that? And he said, oh, some guy I was playing World of Warcraft with.
So a question that I always think about when I'm doing my own writing is, how did this book, Horse, this beautiful book about this animal and about the man who stayed with this animal through the whole thing, how did this change you?
Well, I can't say how it changed me because my life changed so dramatically in the middle of writing it because I was halfway through it when Tony died. And after that, everything was different. And I couldn't even think about writing for a year. And then, I got a piece of advice, and it came to me indirectly from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who had said it to Nina Totenberg, who had then passed it on to a friend of mine at NPR, who passed it on to me. And that advice was, do your work. It might not be your best work, but it'll be good work, and it'll be what saves you. And so the book was the lifeboat that I crawled into after a year. And the second half of the book is a very different book because I was different. So I don't know what this book would have been like or how the characters' lives would have unfolded if I hadn't had this devastating experience of loss and disconnection.
One last question, and it goes back to where we started, the relationship with animals. How does that change you day to day?
That is joy. I mean, I don't know what it would be like not to have connection with animals. And I think, when I met Tony, he didn't really have a thing about dogs. He was kind of down on dogs because his family hadn't had successful pet experiences. And so we had a I guess you'd call it a prenup, because when I met him, he was a smoker. And I said, you're going to have to give that up because I can't live in a house with a smoker, And if you smoke, I will get a dog. And he, of course, fell off the wagon as smokers do. And I said, woof, woof. And we got our first shared dog, and he fell in love with that dog, and he became the biggest dog obsessive. And he reminded me of my own dad, who would do anything for our dogs, and no matter how flawed they were perfect. And my dad would be grilling steak for the dog every afternoon. And Tony just became, he loved the dogs, he loved the alpacas, he loved all the animals that came into our life. The horse, even though the horse was such a time suck for me, but he became just as devoted to them. And he said they brought him joy, they made him smile, and that's true. Yeah.
And that is the change, that joy. Thank you so much. Really. we're going to move to Q&A now, and to questions that you may have. We have one small request, no spoilers, please. And we'd love to have questions. We're going to move back and forth between these mics, and I think there's a roving mic upstairs.
It's good to see you all out there.
It's a beautiful crowd. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much, Geraldine. Welcome to Traverse City, and thank you for your beautiful work. I'm a huge fan, and you know, we sort of touched on this theme of anti-racism and white women writing black stories. And I just want to ask an additional question and dig a little deeper on that. And I guess my question would be more about how does your anti-racist work show up in the everyday? Like, how do you as a white privileged woman advocate on behalf of our BIPOC friends?
I think the best thing we can do, so I was in Iceland, I've been traveling a lot for this book, and I got a question from the audience saying that she had read a review on Goodreads, which is a place I never go because people are so mean on Goodreads. And it had said that the book read like a white woman writing about black people for other white women. And I thought about that, and I thought, I am absolutely fine with that, because I think that the conversations that we need to have are with each other in a way, because black people don't need to hear what we think. They know. This is their lived experience. I think it's for us to confront each other about things that we may not have thought of, and to share what we learn from listening, and confront it when we see it. Like we were talking at lunch today, somebody had a friend who said, "I've never met a racist." And it reminded me of what they say at the poker table: if you don't know who the fish is, you're the fish. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Thank you. How about over here?
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
Bring the mic just a little closer.
Thank you. Would you talk about the painter Scott and how you came about him?
Thomas Scott, what an interesting guy. So again, the strangest things in the book are the true things. So Thomas Scott really was rediscovered because somebody in Kentucky plucked a painting out of a neighbor's throw-out pile. And he was intrigued by this beautiful painting of a horse. And he took it he worked in the physical plant at the University of Kentucky, and he took it to the art department and said, "What can you tell me about this?" And that led to the rediscovery of Thomas Scott and the assembling of all the known works by Thomas Scott. And he was one of two main equestrian painters of the 19th century, and he went around painting all the great thoroughbreds. And also, you know, not so much him, but his mentor, Troy, also painted the black horsemen, and that leads to us having these fantastic representations of these expert black horsemen of the time. But Thomas Scott had started out as a medical student and had to drop out because he couldn't afford to finish his degree. But when the Civil War happened, he joined up with a regiment of Kentucky volunteers that fought on the northern side, and he became the medic of that unit. And he is described in the journals of the chaplain of that unit so vividly. So I could see him so clearly through the chaplain's description of him, and then also through his own writings, because as well as painting, he wrote up the thoroughbred races for the turf press of the day. And there were 3 newspapers just devoted to horse racing in this period. So every hoofbeat Lexington took was documented. And a lot of the writing of the time was by Scott, so I had his voice in my head in a way that he was accessible to me. That's why he's the only person who is writing first person in the novel.
And that's brilliant use of the diary, too, I think, in the novel. I really like that. A question from
the cheap seats.
from upstairs.
Hello.
Hi.
I am curious about how you came up with the title. I was given your book as a gift, and I thought, I don't think I want to read this. I'm not particularly interested in horses. But I did read it, and I ended up saying to my friend, this is one of the best books I have ever read. And I thought, but I wonder why she came up with that title. And I thought of a couple of titles. I thought of Horse Race or Race Horse. And I wondered if you pondered some other ideas.
Well, I like those. Those are good. But yeah, I had the title from the very first conversation I had with the Smithsonian official, because what he had explained to me was how this horse was such a celebrity in his own day, but in the following 100 years, his fame waned. And they had this skeleton, and they didn't care that it was this famous racehorse anymore, because the mission of the Smithsonian had changed from being a cabinet of curiosities to being a scientific research institution. And so what they were interested in was that it was a skeleton of Equus cabolus. It was horse. And so Lexington went from being a celebrity to being horse in the Hall of Mammals with rabbit. Stoat. And that just took root in my imagination, so I really wanted to call the novel Horse. I got so much pushback from the publishers. And I also wanted a picture of a horse on the cover because they're just so beautiful, and there's so many gorgeous photographs, and there's so many ways you could have done the cover with a picture of the horse. And they said, you can have the title Horse, or you can have a picture of a horse. But you can't have both, you have to choose. But, so it's the same with my first novel. It's called Year of Wonders. Nobody wanted me to call a book about the plague Year of Wonders. But I had an idea in my mind about why that was the right title. But a lot of people said to me, I was never going to read a book about the plague, yuck. And I really liked it. So I guess my only wish is that everybody would give a book 25 pages. And if it hasn't grabbed you by 25 pages, chuck it.
Yes, I think we have one more question over here.
This is a virtual question, or? Yeah, so virtual question from Julie Edgar. I would love to know more about your relationship with Valentine.
Well, Valentine is my second horse. So the horse that came from Mexico was named Mantequilla. And she, well, in the equestrian world, the term for what happened with me was I was over-mounted. She was too much horse for me. She had started out as a Mexican ranch horse with hard-handed cowboys, and then she belonged to my friend Katie, who was an expert and fearless young woman, a great rider. And then she comes to me. And I don't know what I'm doing. I've had a couple of months of riding lessons, and I truly believe from this experience that God looks after stupid people. Because 2 days after this horse arrives, I take her out alone for a trail ride. Now, I would never go out alone on a trail ride these days, because I've learned a thing or two. But I saddle her up, and we get just to the edge of the garden, basically, and I realize I forgot to tighten the girth, and I'm underneath her. But that's okay. I get off, I get back on, and we go. And I take this horse from the Mexican Altiplano into dense New England woods. And the horse's nostrils are billowing and her ears are spinning, and I'm too stupid to know that she's terrified. And I think that the only thing that saved me that day from having her bolt and chuck me over a cliff was my euphoria. I've got a horse. I'm riding a horse. And I think that she was thinking, if this stupid tart thinks we're safe, it must be all right. But it didn't take her very long to get my number, and she didn't like my ineptitude, and also she really didn't like winter setting in Massachusetts, and she was in a foul mood. And so I'm having a riding lesson in the yard one day, and you know, they always say, if you feel you're going to fall off, grab the mane, that's why God put it there. No amount of mane grabbing was going to keep me on this horse. She was bucking like a crazy rodeo pony, and I'm in the air, and then I'm on the ground, and my instructor's saying, we usually try to get back on. And I said, yeah, I will. And she said, but you have to stand up first. I realized that was going to be a problem. Anyway, long story short, I found a great home for Mantequilla. She went to a young barrel racer on the Cape, and together they won the Connecticut championship. Yeah. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, a friend says to me, do you think you'll get another horse? And I said, well, I would if I could get a quiet, small one. And he said, you want Valentine. And I did. Valentine is my heart horse and my forever horse, and she has a great sense of humor. And she doesn't care that I'm not a very good rider. And we have a good time together.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm curious about your research and how you may have interacted with today's modern, Kentucky Derby or equestrian horse racing society, and if they embraced this story and if they wanted to honor it, or if it's something that they kind of glossed over and don't want to recognize.
No, I've had a really good reception from the horse community all over the place. And everybody who works in racing knows that they can't go on like they're doing. That's why Churchill Downs is closed. That's why Santa Anita has a bad reputation. The equine malfeasance that has crept into breeding of thoroughbreds, everybody in the industry knows it. And they know that they have killed it. They have made these horses so frail that most of them, if they get 5 starts without breaking down, it's criminal what we've done to these beautiful animals. And so many of them at 5, their career didn't take off, or it's over, and they're hurt and they're sore and they're cross, and they can't really be retrained for anything else, and they're destroyed and wasted. So I've got a lot of problems, and I've had it ever since I was that cub reporter on the Sydney Morning Herald, and I had to go to every race meeting in Sydney and take down details about every horse, and I saw 2 horrible accidents. And I had PTSD from it. I never wanted to go near another racetrack after I got out of that job, because I was in clenched fear about what might happen to the horses. And so the 19th century horses were completely different. Their bones were strong, and it wasn't just about blistering speed. They were fast, but they had stamina. The races were longer. It was more about tactics and competition. It wasn't just who can go fastest. And I think that this is something that racing has to come to terms with. My horse's pasture mate is an off-the-track racehorse called Screaming Hot Wings. And he's been with his owner, my neighbor, since he was 10. And he's one of the lucky ones who had a second career as a jumper, and then with her as an eventer. And the eventers are absolutely crazy people. But now he is 34 years old. And he has taught so many people to ride, and he is still sound. And when you think about him and all he has had to give in his life, so we have a birthday party for him every year, and all the little girls that rode him over the years are now young women, with some of them with kids of their own, and they come and they make him carrot cakes for his birthday. And when you think about him, and then you think about all the horses that end up in the knackery at 5 because they didn't make it. And I just think it's criminal and inhumane.
One more question over here.
Is that me?
Yes.
My book club had a great discussion about your book in May, and it's kind of a small point, but one of the things we were talking about and wondering about is why Jess took that job, of all the jobs she could have taken, why she took that job back in Australia. The job that she took in Australia.
Because it was fun, and she wanted to see those bones. It was all about the dawn horse, this incredibly rare fossil, and I think she has reservations about it. But then she thinks maybe this is what we need to shake us up to realize the extinction crisis we're in. And so this guy has got all these skeletons of extinct animals, and she wants the chance to work with them, even though it's a wacky project. And again, that guy is a real guy. And that museum, if you ever get a chance to go to Tasmania, you have to go to the Museum of Old and New Art. It's run by a guy called David Walsh, who made his money. He's a mathematical genius, and he figured out a way to gamble where he actually won millions and millions of dollars and invested it in an art museum, which is one of the most extraordinary places. And he's obsessed with sex and death. So everything in there, from Egyptian sarcophagi to the edgiest contemporary art, is about either sex or death. And it is a fabulous place. So I thought, okay, Jess's parents are in Tasmania, which is a place I happen to love, so I'm going to send her to work for him. And it's just a short thing, and then she's going to get a PhD and work on, fighting extinction. So.
I think one up.
A question from the upstairs.
Thank you. One of the things that I kept noticing in the book, I'm sorry if I'm echoing to you all, is...
A little louder, please.
I'm sorry. One of the things I noticed is the relationship between the racism during the Civil War and the death. Was that planned?
I think we're getting into spoiler territory, so I'm going to be very indirect in the answer and say, no, it was not. But I think it was influenced by my own loss, and that's all I want to say about that. Yeah.
We have
Just 2 more questions. One here.
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm so excited to...
Just a little closer to the mic, please.
Thank you for being here, and I'm so excited to hear what you had to say about the book. I love the way you braided the parts of your story together, which you referred to, how you braided things together in this book and in the people of the book. That one was amazing, too. But I'm really curious about your work as a young journalist and what it was like to be a female working in that field in the Middle East. And I'm now working on, and it is intense, 9 Parts of Desire. And just the things that you're expressing in that book are very contemporary, as are the other. But the most important thing that I want to ask or mention is that I loved the evolution of Jarrett and his agency to stand up to those people who were trying to tell him what to do or assume that he didn't know. And when he said, no, you can't let Lexington run now, I was so proud of him. So thank you for giving him that agency.
Well, on the what I know from being around horses is, to the horse, the groom is the most important. They don't care about the owner or the trainer or the jockey. The groom is the person who's there in the morning with the bucket of grain, who's there bathing their legs and looking after them when they're sick. And it's the footfall of the groom that the horse responds to in the barn. And so I knew that that was going to be the key relationship. And as for 9 Parts of Desire, that was the first book I wrote, and it's 100% journalist's book. It was my journey to try to understand what was going on with the women in the regions that I was covering. And initially, it was very hard for me as a woman reporter in some of those countries where there isn't really a great acceptance of women in public space. And I had to figure out a way to do this job. And I figured out that my way to do it was to talk to the women, because my male colleagues couldn't do that. And through doing that, I got unbelievable access. By going to talk to Khomeini's wife and daughter, I was invited to the Khomeini family home. I'm sitting having afternoon tea with Mrs. Khomeini. By writing about Queen Noor in Jordan, when she became a bit of a lightning rod for controversy, I ended up sitting in the royal palace in Jordan with King Hussein during the first Gulf War, and so it was a way into the power structure that was acceptable in the region, that through the women I would be introduced back to the men. And I ended up, being able to go into the Bekaa Valley when it was a Hezbollah stronghold and have all these experiences that I wouldn't have had if I hadn't talked to the women.
I'm so glad you talked to the women.
And I wish that book was irrelevant. I wish it was, able to be shredded for cat litter because everything had changed and improved. But unfortunately, I have to say, a book written in 1995, a lot of the movement has been in the wrong direction rather than the right direction.
Yeah, thank you. I think since no one is at that mic, I think we will close this down. We have one last favor to ask of you. There is a picture we like to take with everyone who has a book holding the book. Am I right on this? Yes. And, and, sorry. Yes, and you can take that one. You want me to get it? This is our local swag is here. Gwendolyn, thank you so much for an incredible evening. Look at this.
We'll see you all in the lobby where Geraldine will personalize your book if you'd like. And thank you. Goodbye, Paul.